All right, a good way to practice what you know about planes of motion and joint motions and that sort of thing is to take a stereotypical uniplanar motion and break it down into what's going on. And so what we've got here is a standing long jump, or a broad jump, if you will. And we've got our little skeleton man jumping from one spot to another. And what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at breaking down this motion into its constituent parts. So this is a great motion to study because it includes a lot of elements that are very common in most activities. It includes the stretch shortening cycle, it includes eccentric and concentric muscle actions, and it's in the sagittal plane almost exclusively, which makes it easier for us to really break this thing down. So let's review really quickly what these different planes of motions look like. All right, so we got our figure here in its starting position before we begin the jump here. And so we can rotate around here and introduce our different planes of motion. And so if we remember, if we kind of come around the back here towards our jumper, if we get to this position right here and look at this jumper head on here, we have a plane of motion that divides this jumper into a left and a right half, which is called the sagittal plane. So sagittal plane will divide our jumper into a left half, a right half in this case, and a left half, right? And so any motion that occurs along this plane is going to be a sagittal plane motion. And one of the dead giveaways for sagittal plane motions is that for the most part, they're easiest to view from the side. So the purple or magenta box in the background is the sagittal plane. It's dividing our jumper into a left half and a right half. And so this motion is occurring through that plane because everything is parallel to that plane of motion, okay? If we scrub this back and we look at this jumper from the front, this purple line is our sagittal plane, dividing our jumper into a left half and a right half. And the green is dividing the jumper into a front half and a back half. And we can see this right through here. The green is a frontal plane. So any motion that would mirror that plane would be a frontal plane motion. We don't see any motion really occurring in that plane because the motion is occurring along this magenta, this sagittal plane for our jumper. So not a lot of action going on in that frontal plane for this mechanic. The last plane of motion that we have then is our transverse plane. And the transverse plane divides our body into a top half and a bottom half. And so motions would have to kind of cross the center line, if you will, of the body in order for it to be a transverse plane motion. So if we turn off our frontal plane and if we turn off our sagittal plane, if all we look at is this transverse plane, again, we'd have to have motion that mirrors that in order for it to be considered a transverse plane motion. And there's just not any motion occurring that's mirroring that transverse plane because the motion is occurring forwards and backwards, which again is our sagittal plane. So again, there's our sagittal plane, and our jumper is moving through that plane as we go, just like that. No transverse plane motion really to speak of. It's forwards and backwards motion, which is sagittal plane motion. Because we know it's a sagittal plane motion, we now know it's this motion that we're going to describe around our shoulders and our hips and our knees and ankles. They're only going to be flexion, extension, plantar flexion, and dorsiflexion because those are the sagittal plane motions. Remember that the frontal plane motions, the common ones we normally look at, would include things like abduction and adduction and lateral flexion. Those are frontal plane motions. There's none of that going on in this action. And within the transverse plane, we've got horizontal adduction, horizontal abduction, internal rotation, external rotation. There's none of that going on either. So we can rule out all of those joint actions because this is only a sagittal plane motion. So let's take this in turn and look at the start of this motion. From this position to this position, the main action we have is our shoulders are moving. And our shoulders are moving from here to here, which represents a movement back towards our anatomical position, our reference position. Because of that, it means it's shoulder extension, because extension moves you back to that anatomical position in the sagittal plane. So that's the motion of our shoulders as we go from here to here. Now note the shoulders keep going backwards, and so it's extension that goes through the anatomical reference position, which we can call hyperextension, all the way until we get to this position. And now we start seeing the shoulders coming forward. So that's full extension, if you will. And now we start to see flexion as the shoulders are now going away from our anatomical position. They reach full extension up here, or full flexion, really, if you want to think about it, right? That's our full flexion position of our shoulders. And then they begin to come back down, again, back towards the anatomical position. So it's going to be shoulder extension as we get towards the ground and right to that position. And then at the very end, a little bit of shoulder flexion as the athlete gathers from landing. So again, from the very start, we have shoulder extension as we move back towards the anatomical position, shoulder hyperextension, if you will, as we move beyond the anatomical position backwards, and then shoulder flexion as we go forward up to the point at the top of the head, top of the jump, and then the arms begin to come back down, which is shoulder extension right at impact, and then at impact, the arms swing freely forward, which again is going to be shoulder flexion. Okay, so that's the motion around the shoulder. At the trunk, the main thing we're looking here would be trunk flexion or trunk extension. So in this position, we are in the fully trunk extended position because we are in what effectively amounts to the anatomical position, except for the arms are not where we'd expect them to be in an anatomical position because the shoulders are fully flexed at this point. So from here to here, the trunk isn't really moving, but then we start to see a little bit of trunk flexion occurring right there. You can see right there, that's trunk flexion as our athlete bends over. And that's kind of that fully flexed position at the base. And then as we go forwards and the body begins to move back up to here, that's going to be trunk extension as the body goes into this full position and it remains in that extended position until we start to land here. And now we start to see more trunk flexion again as our athlete absorbs impact. We see more trunk flexion. And then if the athlete were to stand back up again, we would see trunk extension. So again, from the start, fully extended the trunk is, and then we begin to see a little bit of trunk flexion here, and then explosively jumping creates trunk extension. The trunk extension holds steady until getting towards impact, and we see the athlete leaning over again. The hips. So again, we are in a fully extended position with the hips. They can really only either hyperextend or flex from here. And so let's watch and see what happens. As the athlete begins to crouch down, we see there is hip flexion going on because the angle is moving further forward for our jumper. The hip is flexing to create that motion. Flexing, flexing, flexing. And then as the athlete begins to gather to jump, we see the hips extend. So that's hip extension right through there. From here to here is hip extension. So from the start, hip flexion to get to the bottom of the jump, and then extension, fully extended, maybe even hyperextended, if you will, through here. That kind of C curve that we look at for jumpers. And then preparing for landing, we see the hips begin to flex, absorb the impact and get the legs out in front. So fully flexed right here, and then an absorption there with the knee going into flexion. We'll talk about the knees in a second here. Okay. So from the top, hip flexion, and then explosion is hip extension, and then they flex forwards and then catch ourselves. Okay. So that's our hip action. What about the knees? Knees, very similar pattern to what we just saw with the hips, because at the start of the position, we are fully extended at the knees. And then as the knees begin to break or bend, flex, there's knee flexion, and then extension. Knee flexion, and then knee extension. And then again, they begin to flex again to prepare to get the legs through and to land. So there's actually a little bit of extension going on here at the knee as we reach out in front. And then at impact, the knees absorb the impact, and we see even more knee flexion to absorb the impact at the end. So knee flexion, loading up, knee extension, exploding, knee flexion to help our legs get through, and then again, more flexion to absorb the impact. Final joint to look at then would be our ankles, looking to see what kind of dorsiflexion or plantar flexion there is. Anytime that angle between the lower leg, the shin, and the foot gets smaller, the shank, if you will, and the top of the foot gets smaller, that's going to be dorsiflexion. So that's what we see right through here. That's dorsiflexion right there at the ankle. And then so that's loading up the calf musculature, if you will, and the Achilles tendon's being loaded up here. And then as the athlete jumps, the toe points, and then we have plantar flexion. So very similar pattern to what we just saw with the hips and the knees. Dorsiflexion, and then plantar flexion to jump, plantar flex, and then begin to dorsiflex to help the legs get through, dorsiflex, and then landing in that position, more plantar flexion as the heels lead to absorb the impact, and then as that impact comes down, dorsiflexion again, because that angle is shortening between the shin and the top of the foot. So it's a repeated pattern, right? We have the initial, if we exclude our arms from what's going on in here, if we just look at our lower body, the very first part of this jump is a counter movement, meaning that we're moving downwards and kind of backwards in order to help us jump upwards and forwards. So we have this counter movement at the hips, knees, and ankles, right? We're going downwards, counter to the direction we want to go. That's why it's a counter movement jump. Dip down, and then we have what we call the triple extension. Extension at the hip, extension at the knee, and extension at the ankle to explode upwards. And then it reverses that pattern as we absorb impact at the very end. The shoulders are just there to kind of help everything move for us. And so the arms are going to create some momentum for us by swinging backwards. They go through their extension and then they flex. So kind of the exact opposite. Your arms are moving in opposition, if you will, flexion extension wise to what your legs are doing. Downwards and then upwards and impact. What we've got. The last thing you might think about here would be thinking about eccentric versus concentric and isometric muscle actions. The very first motion here, everything is occurring eccentrically. We're letting gravity push us downwards. Arms are moving downwards. Gravity's doing its work here. And then as soon as we begin to go upwards, it's now a concentric muscle action at the deltoids, at the hips, the quads. Hamstrings are contracting concentrically. Calf muscles, gastroc, soleus are contracting concentrically as we explode upwards. And then at impact, we have another eccentric muscle action occurring to absorb that impact at the very end. Okay? Sagittal plane motions all the way. Flexion, extension, dorsiflexion, plantar flexion at the shoulders, at the hips, at the trunk, at the knees, and at the ankles.